For nearly 2 decades, she sat behind that desk, danced across that stage, and convinced an entire nation that one woman could be the living definition of joy. Ellen DeGeneres didn't just host a television show, she built a religion around kindness, and hundreds of millions of people believed every word of it. But on a quiet Tuesday morning in 2020, the first crack appeared, and once it started, it didn't stop. The stories didn't come from tabloids. They didn't come from bitter rivals or anonymous sources with an agenda. They came from real people, ordinary people. Men and women who had spent years working behind the cameras of the Ellen DeGeneres show and had finally decided they were done staying silent. What they described was nothing like what you saw on screen: fear, humiliation, racism. A culture of silence so thick that some employees were reportedly told not to even make eye contact with Ellen backstage. A world where smiling for the cameras was mandatory, but being treated like a human being was not. When those stories hit the internet, Ellen's team said nothing, not a single word, and that silence. That silence was deafening, because this was the woman who had built her entire empire on one sentence: be kind to one another. And now the people who knew her best were saying something very, very different. But what happened next changed everything, because this wasn't just the end of a television show. This was the unraveling of a legend, a persona that had taken 30 years to build and just a few months to destroy. At 68 years old, Ellen DeGeneres is no longer the woman America thought it knew. And the truth behind that smile, it's far more complicated and far more heartbreaking than anyone expected. Ellen Lee DeGeneres grew up in Metairie, Louisiana, in a home that didn't stay whole for long. Her parents divorced when she was still a teenager. She moved around, she struggled. She sold vacuum cleaners and waited tables and tended bar just to keep the lights on. Life gave her very little, but it gave her one extraordinary thing: a gift. The ability to walk into any room, open her mouth, and make every single person in it feel like the best moment of their day had just arrived. That gift took her from small comedy clubs in New Orleans to the national stage. And in 1986, she stood in front of Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show and delivered a set so electric, Carson personally invited her back to the couch the same night. A distinction almost no comedian in history had ever received. Hollywood sat up and paid attention. She landed her own sitcom. She became a household name. And then in 1997, she did something that would cost her absolutely everything. She came out as gay on television in front of the entire country at a time when that kind of courage came with a brutal price. The backlash was immediate and merciless. The sitcom was canceled. Advertisers disappeared overnight. The phone stopped ringing. For nearly 3 years, Ellen DeGeneres essentially ceased to exist in Hollywood. Most people don't come back from that. Ellen did. She rebuilt herself from nothing. And in 2003, the Ellen DeGeneres Show launched and became something nobody had quite seen before. A daytime program built entirely on warmth, generosity, and the radical idea that television could make you feel genuinely good. She won Emmy after Emmy. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She hosted the Oscars. She danced every single day like she was the happiest person alive, and everyone believed her. Everyone. But the rumors had been moving through Hollywood for years. Quietly at first, hushed conversations at industry events, a raised eyebrow here, a knowing look there. People who had worked on the show or knew people who had would sometimes let something slip. That Ellen was difficult, that the set wasn't what it appeared to be. That the warmth you saw on camera disappeared the moment the light went off, but nobody pushed it, nobody published it, because Ellen's image was simply too powerful, too polished, too beloved. She was untouchable, and in Hollywood, untouchable people stay untouchable until they don't. Then COVID-19 shut down the world. Production on the show halted in March 2020. The studio went dark. The cameras stopped rolling, and without the daily machinery of performance to keep everything in place, something started to crack open. Staff members who had kept their mouths shut, some for years, started talking, not just to each other, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. Former employees described a workplace culture that felt hostile and humiliating. One black employee said she had been instructed by a producer not to speak to Ellen directly. Another said she had been let go after taking medical leave. The stories were specific, they were detailed, they were consistent, and there were a lot of them. But what happened next, no one saw coming, because the investigation that followed didn't just target Ellen. It targeted the people who had been running her world behind the scenes. In July 2020, BuzzFeed News published an explosive report. Over a dozen former employees described a culture of sexual misconduct, racial discrimination, and psychological intimidation festering within the production. Three senior producers were named by name: Ed Glavin, Kevin Lemon, and Jonathan Norman. The allegations were disturbing, graphic, and deeply credible. But buried inside that report was something even more devastating. Former employees weren't just talking about the producers, they were talking about Ellen herself. Multiple staff members described her as cold, dismissive, and at times openly cruel to the people who worked for her. One person said they had been explicitly told not to make eye contact with her backstage. Others described being ignored, belittled, and made to feel invisible. And that's when everything started to fall apart. Warner Media launched a formal internal investigation. The show that had once been the gold standard of feel-good television was now under corporate review. Ellen responded with a letter to her staff, acknowledging that things had gone wrong. Saying she couldn't be everywhere at once, promising that changes were coming, but for many of the people who had lived through it, the words felt hollow, carefully worded. More about protecting the brand than confronting the truth. The public divided, some rallied around her, others felt the damage was far beyond repair. But the truth behind all of it was even more surprising, because the worst was still coming. When season 18 launched in September 2020, Ellen walked out onto that stage and looked directly into the camera. She told her audience she had learned from everything that had happened. That the show was changing, that she was still the same person who believed in kindness, but the cameras couldn't hide what the ratings were saying. Viewers were leaving, slowly at first, then faster. Advertisers grew cautious. Celebrities who had once happily booked the show began finding reasons not to. The cultural tide had turned, and it was moving against her. Then came the wave that truly blindsided Hollywood. Ordinary people and public figures alike began sharing their own experiences, or simply contradicting the image Ellen had spent decades building. Comedian Kevin T. Porter had lit the fuse months earlier, inviting followers on Twitter to share their Ellen stories. Thousands responded. The thread became a phenomenon. And the stories that poured in painted a portrait of someone almost unrecognizable from the woman on screen. The most gut-punch moment came quietly, almost without fanfare, but Hollywood noticed. People who had once enthusiastically defended Ellen went strangely silent, and she and Portia retreated from public life almost entirely. Ellen DeGeneres was no longer the queen of daytime television. She was becoming a cautionary tale. And for someone who had already clawed her way back once before, who had survived Hollywood turning its back on her for coming out, this second abandonment hit differently. Because the first time, the world had rejected who she was. This time, the world was questioning whether the person she claimed to be had ever really existed at all. By 2021, the writing was on the wall. The show that had once felt electric, joyful, and alive now felt like something being kept on life support. The numbers kept falling. The momentum was gone. The magic that had defined 19 seasons of television simply could not be manufactured anymore. And then, in May 2022, she made the announcement. After 19 seasons, the Ellen DeGeneres show was ending. The final episode aired on May 26, 2022. Ellen said it was her decision, that she had done what she set out to do. That it was simply time to move on, and maybe part of that was true, but people who knew the industry heard what was not being said. The show hadn't been canceled in the formal sense of the word. But the business of television is not sentimental, and the math had simply stopped working. What made the ending so emotionally complex was this: Ellen DeGeneres is not a monster. She is also not the saint she presented herself to be. She is something far more uncomfortable, a genuinely complicated human being who built a global empire on the very qualities she sometimes struggled to live by. The gap between the public image and the private reality had grown too wide, too visible, too impossible to explain away. And there was still one question hanging in the air that nobody had fully answered. How much did Ellen actually know about what was happening inside her own show, and what did she choose not to see? That question has never been answered, not publicly, not honestly. Today, at 68 years old, Ellen DeGeneres has stepped almost entirely out of public life. She and Portia sold their California estate and moved abroad, spending long stretches of time quietly in the English countryside. She has done a handful of stand-up shows, small, private, far from the spotlight she once commanded. There has been no comeback special, no tearful redemption interview. No moment designed to reclaim the narrative, just silence. And in a way, that silence says more than any monologue ever could. Ellen DeGeneres changed television. She broke barriers that could have stayed broken. She made history at a moment when history could have crushed her, and she built something genuinely extraordinary from the wreckage of her early life. But somewhere along the way, she also built walls, between herself and the people around her, between the image she projected and the reality she lived in. And in the end, it was those walls, not her enemies, not the media, not the cancel culture she never named, that brought everything down. At 68, the woman who told the world to be kind is living quietly with the weight of her own story. And maybe that is the most human thing of all. So here's the question only you can answer. Was Ellen DeGeneres a victim, someone torn apart by a media machine hungry for a fall from grace? Or did the truth finally catch up with someone who had been shielded by fame for far too long? Maybe it's both, maybe it's neither, but it's a story that doesn't leave you easily. Tell us what you think in the comments. We want to hear your take. And if you're here for real celebrity stories told with real emotion, no fluff, no filler, just the truth, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The next one you won't want to miss.